My name is Marcus Dalton, and for 15 years, I was the one who kept the lights on, literally and figuratively, at Halcyon Suites, the hotel chain my family built from scratch. I wasn't after titles or applause. I just made sure the systems ran smoothly. Our 8 properties across the Northeast stayed profitable. The staff felt respected, and guests kept returning. Clarissa, my sister, was the one everyone saw. She spoke at conferences, smiled for investors, posed in glossy brochures. And 11 days after she was appointed president of Halcyon, she stood across from me at our Boston headquarters and fired me without blinking. If you're drawn to stories of quiet strength and shocking betrayals, don't forget to sub, like, and share the channel. Your support helps uncover the truth beneath the polish. Marcus, she said, arms crossed like she was talking to a stranger. We're moving in a new direction. The board agrees we need a fresh operational strategy. The board, of course, consisted of Clarissa, our semi-retired father, and 2 of her business school friends she had brought in just last week. We've hired a consultant from Wyndham. He'll handle your responsibilities moving forward. I didn't argue, didn't react. I just nodded and began quietly packing my things. No point in asking questions I already knew the answers to. Clarissa never appreciated the operational side of things, the late-night vendor calls, the structural issues, the people problems. That had always been my lane. I placed my grandfather's black and white photo in the box last. It showed him outside our first location in Bar Harbor, holding a paintbrush and beaming with pride. Clarissa once called it too old-fashioned to hang in her office. I thought it was the heart of everything we'd built. Nothing to say? She asked, glancing at her watch, perfectly manicured and unbothered. I gave her the faintest smile. Good luck with Camden Point. Her eyes tightened. She knew Camden was the biggest project on our books. Halfway done, dangerously over budget, and reliant on supplier contracts I'd spent years nurturing. Without me, it would be chaos. We'll manage, she said quickly. My consultant has handled properties twice that size. Sure, I replied, and walked out the door with a single cardboard box and the knowledge that what I'd built wouldn't disappear just because I was no longer on the payroll. What Clarissa didn't realize, she hadn't bothered to ask, was that 5 years ago, our father pulled me aside over a quiet lunch and said something I'd never forgotten. Hotels come and go, son. But land? Land stays. I took that to heart. And while she collected press features and business awards, I made other plans, quiet ones, the kind that grow roots. The morning after I left Halcyon Suites, I woke at 5:30 a.m., out of habit, not necessity. For 15 years, that was my rhythm. Before the sun came up, I'd already be reviewing overnight reports from our properties, handling emergencies before the front desk even switched shifts. But now, my phone was still. No pings, no texts, just silence. I poured black coffee into my favorite ceramic mug and stepped out onto the back porch of my brownstone overlooking Boston Harbor. The container ships moved quietly through the water, each one deliberate and unhurried. I always admired that kind of efficiency. Silent, purposeful, no need for credit or applause. Just steady progress. As I took a slow sip, my phone finally buzzed. It was Miguel, our longtime maintenance chief at the Camden Point location. Heard what happened, the message read. They're lost, man. New guys already making changes, cutting corners on the renovation. Not good. I stared at the screen for a while before typing. Thanks. I didn't offer advice. I wasn't part of that world anymore. But it stayed with me. His words, the tone. I knew what cutting corners meant. Deferred maintenance, shortcut renovations, angry guests. I'd spent years preventing those things, building trust room by room, team by team. And now it was unraveling. Just days after I walked away, I tried to shake it off, turned my attention to the one thing Clarissa didn't know, had never bothered to notice. 5 years ago, over ribeye and red wine at Morrison's Grill, our father leaned across the table and lowered his voice, in that way he did when he meant business. "Marcus, hotels are what we do, but land? Land is where the real power lives. Never forget that." At the time, I wasn't sure what he meant. But a month later, during a quarterly review, I saw it. 3 of our top-performing properties, Bar Harbor, Camden Point, and Portsmouth, were built on land we didn't actually own. We leased it, and those leases were decades old. The original owners had passed away, and their heirs were starting to sniff around, exploring new valuations, new options. I flagged it in a quiet memo to my father. "This is a risk," I wrote. "If someone else buys that land and jacks up the lease rates, we're stuck." He agreed, but said capital was tied up in new builds. That's when I offered something bold, something I'd never shared with Clarissa. "I'll buy the land," I told him, personally, then lease it back to Halcyon at the same rates. He studied me long and hard. "That's a significant personal investment." "I've been saving," I said, "and I believe in this company." A week later, he introduced me to his banker. 3 months after that, I became the quiet owner of the land beneath our 3 most profitable hotels. I registered the holding under a new entity, MD Ventures, short for Marcus Dalton. Every payment Halcyon made for those leases went to that name. It was all spelled out in the corporate paperwork, transparent, legal, and signed off by the board. Clarissa never noticed. That morning, as the sun spilled over the harbor, I walked back inside and opened the drawer in my home office. There it was, the original survey of Camden Point's lot, framed next to the signed deed. I'd protected the foundation of everything she was trying to control, and she didn't even know it. I wasn't angry, not anymore. What I felt was clarity, the calm certainty that storms pass, but roots hold, and mine were planted deep. The following morning, I didn't rush anywhere. No blazer, no conference calls. Just me, a slow cup of coffee, and the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock. It was strange how fast a 15-year routine could dissolve. No overnight property reports to review, no morning calls from night shift managers, no spreadsheets waiting in my inbox. The silence felt heavier than I expected. I stepped onto the porch again, same view, Boston Harbor stretching out beneath a soft gray sky, ships gliding like ghosts across the water. But today, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt suspended, like the breath right before a fall. My phone buzzed again. "Miguel? Update. Consultants pushing new suppliers, cheaper stuff. Housekeeping's panicking. Maintenance schedule's already off. They're calling it efficiency." My jaw clenched. That word, efficiency, was so often a disguise for neglect. You don't streamline a property by gutting the trust your team relies on. I knew what would come next. Complaints, bad reviews, rising turnover. But I said nothing. Not my battle anymore. I sent a short reply. "Thanks for the heads up. Hang in there." And yet, I couldn't look away. My phone buzzed again. This time, a short message from my father. "Breakfast, Rosie's. Yet to money." My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. Rosie's diner was 2 blocks from our first Halcyon office. We hadn't been there together in years. When I walked in, he was already seated at the far booth, nursing a cup of coffee and looking older than I remembered. His tie was crooked, and his posture wasn't as firm as it used to be. He didn't smile, She told me after it was done, he said. I would have handled it differently. But you didn't stop it, I replied, keeping my tone even. He sighed, stirring his coffee slowly. Clarissa believes Halcyon needs to evolve. More corporate, less family. And you agree? He hesitated. She has a vision the board finds compelling. I let the words hang. The waitress brought our usuals, black coffee and blueberry pancakes for him, eggs and rye toast for me. We didn't need to order. Some things, apparently, still held. After a moment, he said, She doesn't understand the leases. The ones on the land. I know, I said, cutting my eggs. It's all in the documentation. But she never reads the footnotes. She thinks MD Ventures is a third-party holding firm. Technically true, I said. It just happens to be my holding firm. He looked at me carefully, like he was seeing something for the first time. She's in over her head, Marcus. But she won't admit it. She's already calling meetings about operating costs. They'll go up, I said plainly. Market rate leases, nothing inflated, just what the land is worth now. That'll hit hard, he muttered. It's not personal, it's business, I replied, echoing the very words Clarissa used on me. We finished the meal mostly in silence. As we stood to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Your sister plays to win. You build to last. Don't lose sight of that. I watched him walk out ahead of me, shoulders bent not just from age, but from the weight of letting one child break what the other had worked so long to protect. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't just about leadership styles. It was about values, about who believes in foundations, who mistakes momentum for substance. Later that week, around noon, there was a sharp knock at my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. The moment I opened it, Clarissa brushed past me without invitation. She didn't even make eye contact. She walked straight into the living room like she still owned the space, as if the company title extended into every room I might occupy. You're ignoring me, she snapped, dropping her designer handbag onto the couch like a claim. I'm respecting your decision, I replied calmly, closing the door behind her. You made it clear I'm no longer involved in company business. She turned, arms crossed, wearing the same blazer she wore the day she fired me. Some files are missing, she said. Vendor contracts, maintenance schedules, renovation blueprints for Camden Point, and there's a gap in the lease documentation. Legal flagged it. I didn't blink. Everything's on the shared drive, organized by property, department, and fiscal quarter, just like always. Well, your system isn't exactly intuitive, she shot back, and your replacement needs context. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee. I didn't offer her one. My replacement, I echoed, is a hospitality expert who's turned around properties twice our size. I'm sure he can figure out a filing structure. Her lips tightened. She didn't appreciate having her own words used against her. This isn't helpful, Marcus. The company needs... I don't work for the company anymore, I interrupted. Remember? Clarissa stood up, brushing imaginary lint from her skirt. Fine, I'll have legal make a formal request. Do what you need to do, I said, walking to the door. She stopped just short of it, glanced around my living room, books, framed blueprints, a photo of our grandfather in Bar Harbor. And for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Regret? Uncertainty? It vanished quickly. We're trying to hold things together, she muttered. Then you should have thought about that before cutting the foundation loose, I answered. She left without another word. A few days later, I received a certified letter from Halcyon's attorneys, requesting full access to all materials related to my time at the company. I didn't flinch. I sent the letter to my own lawyer, who responded professionally with a list of everything already available in the company system, along with a reminder that personal notes and documents created outside of company scope remained my property. And just like that, the lines had been drawn. What had once been family was now strictly legal. What had once been trust was now paperwork and posturing. But I wasn't shaken. I'd spent years building order from chaos, anticipating problems before they erupted. Clarissa had always thought she could lead from a stage. But leadership isn't about commanding a room. It's about what happens when no one's watching. And now, everyone was watching. A week passed before the next blow arrived. Not with drama, but with the sterile weight of legal formality. A certified envelope, crisp and heavy, slid through my mail slot early Monday morning. I already knew what it was before opening it. Inside, Halcyon's legal team had formally requested access to all documents, communications, and materials I had created or handled during my time with the company. It was phrased like a summons, but read like a challenge, as if I were hiding something. As if the years I spent keeping their operations afloat could be reduced to files and folders. I forwarded the letter to Patricia Lang, my attorney. She didn't seem surprised. "We'll respond with professionalism," she said. "A full list of what's already available on their servers, and a firm reminder that your personal materials are protected under contract law." While the lawyers traded paperwork, my phone began to buzz again, but not from executives. It was my old team, staff from Camden Point, maintenance leads, even front desk supervisors. The messages varied, but the theme was the same. Things were unraveling. The new consultant, Clarissa's golden solution, was cutting hours, scrapping long-standing supplier relationships in favor of cheaper options, delaying basic upkeep in the name of cost control. I knew exactly what was happening. Profit sheets would look healthier for a quarter or two, just long enough to impress shareholders or make board members complacent. But cracks were forming, literal and figurative. "You always said trust was the most expensive thing to lose," one message read. "We're losing it fast." I stared at that one for a while. It wasn't just the operations falling apart. It was the people. The ones I'd trained. The ones who stayed late without being asked. The ones who called me at 2 a.m. Not because they had to, but because they knew I'd care. And yet, I reminded myself, I was no longer there. I had handed over the keys. Whatever happened now was not mine to fix. Then came the tipping point. An email from Halcyon's insurance provider landed in my inbox. They were requesting confirmation of recent ownership changes at 3 properties: Bar Harbor, Camden Point, and Portsmouth. Apparently, someone in Halcyon's risk division had attempted to update the insurance policies and stumbled onto a truth that Clarissa had never bothered to verify. Halcyon didn't own the land beneath its 3 crown jewels. I did. The leases were in place. The payments were current. All documents had been properly filed under MD Ventures. But until now, Clarissa hadn't connected the dots. She had been signing off on expense reports for 5 years, never realizing that the rental payments were flowing to her brother. I forwarded the insurance inquiry to Patricia. She called almost immediately. "This won't sit quietly," she said. "They'll claim you concealed it." "Nothing was hidden," I answered. "They just never looked." The next morning, my father called. His voice was tight. "Did you know your sister never read the lease terms?" "Yes," I said. "I assumed you knew that too." He exhaled hard. She's called for an emergency board meeting. Says this is a breach of trust. I let the silence stretch. She's accusing you of hiding information, he added. Every agreement was reviewed by company counsel, I replied. She signed them all. BK Holdings was always visible on the records. She thought it was a third-party firm, he muttered. Didn't realize it was you. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. This wasn't a game to me. It never had been. She built her strategy on a foundation she didn't own, I said quietly. And now, that foundation was shifting beneath her. 2 days after the insurance debacle, I drove across town to the Suffolk County Public Records Office. I didn't go there often, but something about Clarissa's escalating panic didn't sit right with me. Her tone in the board memo, the legal posturing, the sudden urgency, it all hinted at something bigger, something deeper than just poor management or oversight. I sat in a quiet corner with my laptop and requested access to digital permit archives. My first stop was the deed records. Everything regarding MD Ventures and the 3 land parcels was intact, legally filed, traceable, and clear. But something tugged at me, a sense that I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was uncovering something. Out of curiosity, I expanded my search to adjacent counties. If Clarissa was trying to strengthen Halcyon's position, she'd likely filed expansion permits somewhere nearby. What I found hit me like a slow, cold wave. There, under the name Clarissa Langford, her married name, were multiple applications for development permits. Not under Halcyon Suites, not on behalf of the company, but through a private entity, Langford Vision LLC. My breath caught. One of the permits was for a hotel development on coastal land just 20 minutes south of Portsmouth, a quiet inlet I'd once proposed as a long-term expansion site for Halcyon. Another was listed near Bar Harbor, dangerously close to our oldest property. And a third, still pending approval, sat on land adjacent to Camden Point. I clicked through the applications. Each bore her signature. Each listed Langford Vision LLC as the project sponsor. And each stated a business purpose alarmingly familiar. Luxury boutique hotel development leveraging industry experience, operational best practices, and existing client base relationships from prior brand leadership. The words twisted in my stomach. It wasn't just ambition. This wasn't about taking Halcyon into a new era. This was about replacing it. Clarissa hadn't fired me because she thought I was obsolete. She'd fired me because I was in the way, a potential obstacle to a separate empire she was building on the side, one that mirrored Halcyon so closely it was hard to tell where the old company ended and her new one began. I called Patricia immediately. I need you to look into a company, Langford Vision LLC. I believe my sister owns it. She didn't even hesitate. I'm on it. 2 days later, I had the full picture. Patricia's contacts in real estate law had obtained a leaked investor memo circulated by Clarissa herself. The pitch was polished. A modern hotel chain rooted in her deep industry expertise and decade-long leadership at a legacy brand. She boasted of her track record, spoke of inefficiencies in legacy companies, and promised her new brand would capitalize on current discontent in the market. One line stood out in bold: "We intend to target markets currently dominated by outdated family-run properties in the Northeast, beginning with Camden Point, Bar Harbor, and Portsmouth." Outdated family-run properties. She was referring to Halcyon, to me, and she wasn't even being subtle about it. I sat in my office, staring out the window at the harbor, the documents spread out on my desk. All those years, every meeting, every late-night call, every fire I put out while she chased accolades. This was her endgame. Clarissa hadn't just turned her back on our legacy. She was planning to gut it and build something shinier on top of the wreckage. But there was one thing she hadn't planned for. I still owned the ground she was standing on. The following morning, I received an unexpected call. It was Vincent Ramirez, one of the board members Clarissa had brought in during her strategic restructuring phase. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I walked out with my things, and even then, we'd barely exchanged more than nods in passing. That's what made the call so strange. "I've seen the lease renewal terms," he said bluntly, skipping any sort of greeting. "And I've also heard whispers about Langford Vision." I sat up straighter in my chair. "They're not whispers," I said calmly. "They're filings, public documents, business permits, and a pitch deck sent to investors outlining a direct competitive strategy against Halcyon Suites." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I respected your father," Vincent finally said. "That's why I joined this board. It wasn't for stock options or networking. I believed in what the company stood for." "I did too," I replied, "until it stopped standing for anything." Another beat of silence, heavier this time. "She told us you stepped away voluntarily, said you wanted to explore new ventures." Clarissa framed it as amicable, your choice. "She mentioned her own new venture?" "No," he said quietly. "That's why I'm calling." Vincent cleared his throat. "There's an emergency board meeting scheduled this Friday at 2. Clarissa intends to propose a full divestiture of the Bar Harbor, Camden Point, and Portsmouth properties." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. "She's arguing the new lease terms render them unprofitable," he continued, "and that selling the buildings would free up capital for a pivot. She's using buzzwords like tech-forward hospitality integration and brand agility." The final piece clicked into place. She wasn't just trying to escape my control of the land. She was attempting to acquire the buildings at fire sale prices through her own shadow company. Langford Vision would buy them, and then I'd be her landlord without even realizing it. It was smart, ruthless, and deeply dishonest. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I didn't tell you anything," Vincent replied, then hung up. I sat back in my chair and stared at the framed blueprint of our Bar Harbor property hanging on the wall. It had been there since the day I closed the land purchase 5 years ago, a reminder of the foundation beneath the facade. Clarissa had built a plan around deception, around manipulating systems she never truly understood. She'd bet that no one would notice, that the board would follow her charm and confidence, that her credentials would outweigh her ethics. But she miscalculated one thing. I wasn't just a former operations guy. I was the only person who knew exactly what she was trying to bury. And I had the paper trail to prove it. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure she didn't burn down the house just to build her own tower. 2 days before the board meeting, I boarded a morning flight to New York. I didn't tell anyone. No posts, no calls. Just a quiet trip with a single folder tucked inside my briefcase. It contained financial, site histories, lease documents, and something more valuable than all of it: clarity. By early afternoon, I was sitting across from Julian Barrett, CEO of Eastbridge Hospitality Group. We'd met years ago at a conference in Denver. At the time, he'd offered me a leadership role, but I'd turned it down out of loyalty to Halcyon. He remembered. "I heard Halcyon might be divesting some real estate," Julian said, sipping espresso from a glass cup so thin it looked like crystal. "Interesting timing." 3 properties, I confirmed. Camden Point, Bar Harbor, and Portsmouth. His eyes narrowed. Those are your strongest assets. You sure they're for sale? They will be, I said. The board's about to be convinced they're too expensive to keep. The new lease terms make the buildings look unprofitable. And you just happen to own the land underneath. I nodded. What Clarissa didn't realize is that controlling the land gives you more than leverage. It gives you time and options. Julian leaned back, studying me. So, what are you proposing? A partnership, I said, sliding the folder across his desk. Eastbridge acquires the buildings once Halcyon sells. I maintain land ownership through MD Ventures, but offer you long-term leases. Fair terms, stable rates, no games. He opened the folder and scanned the first few pages. I looked out of the window behind him. His office had an unobstructed view of Central Park, framed in soft afternoon light. It was the kind of view Clarissa always chased. Corner office, full skyline, the image of success. But I didn't envy it. Not anymore. These numbers are strong, Julian said, flipping to the financial projections. Staff retention clause, too. That's rare. That clause matters, I said. The teams at those hotels, they built the guest experience. Most of them have been there longer than Clarissa's been in charge. He tapped a finger against the page. You could make more money raising the lease and letting her sweat it out. She's not going to sweat, I replied. She's going to sabotage. She's already preparing to offload the buildings, then buy them back through her new shell company at a discount. Julian raised an eyebrow. Langford Vision? I nodded. You've heard of it? Whispers, he said. Enough to know she's courting investors behind the scenes. I'm not interested in hurting Halcyon, I said quietly. I'm interested in protecting the people and the standards we spent decades building. Julian studied me again, longer this time. You don't want power. You want preservation. Exactly. He closed the folder slowly. We've been looking to expand our Northeast presence. These 3 properties could anchor a full regional rollout. They're ready, I said. Solid infrastructure, loyal staff, strong markets. All they need is someone who actually sees their value. Julian stood and extended his hand. Let's move forward. I'll have my team contact yours. As I shook his hand, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. After all the chaos, the betrayals, the maneuvering, this wasn't an act of revenge. It was restoration. It was legacy. Protected. Friday afternoon arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle. It felt appropriate. Like the weather knew this wasn't just another board meeting. I walked into Halcyon's headquarters for the first time since being dismissed. This time not as an employee, not even as a consultant, but as something far less comfortable for them, the truth in human form. The conference room was already full. Clarissa sat at the head of the long walnut table, flanked by her closest allies. She didn't look at me as I entered. My father was seated to her right, more lined and silent than I remembered. The rest of the board members, including Vincent, watched me with unreadable expressions. I took a seat at the far end, calm, focused, prepared. Clarissa cleared her throat. Let's be clear about what this meeting is, she began, voice crisp and cold. My brother is orchestrating a hostile interference with Halcyon's operations and real estate assets. The lease hikes he's imposed on our legacy properties make them financially unsustainable. We must discuss divestiture. I didn't flinch. I opened my portfolio and began sliding folders down the table, one for each board member. No, I said. This meeting is about transparency. Clarissa raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? These documents, I continued, show that while serving as president of Halcyon Suites, Clarissa Langford was also establishing a direct competitor, Langford Vision LLC. She filed permits for 3 boutique hotel developments in the same markets where Halcyon's most profitable properties operate. These documents include timelines, business plans, and investor pitch materials that reference leveraging client loyalty and operational knowledge gained from Halcyon. While drawing a salary here, she built something meant to replace it. Gasps were audible around the table. My father opened his folder and stared, stunned. "Is this true?" he asked, not looking at her yet. Clarissa's face hardened. Langford Vision is a consulting entity. These are development possibilities, not firm, with blueprints, permits, and timelines, I interrupted. You weren't just preparing, you were positioning. And then you tried to manipulate this board into selling Halcyon's core properties so your shell company could buy them at a loss. She went silent. Not even a denial. Just silence. I turned back to the board. Eastbridge Hospitality Group has offered above-market value for all 3 properties. Their proposal includes guaranteed staff retention, honoring existing bookings, and preserving brand reputation. Everything Clarissa's venture would have discarded. My father looked down at the papers in front of him. His hands trembled slightly. Vincent cleared his throat. The offer from Eastbridge is compelling, and the documents you provided raise serious ethical concerns. Clarissa stood suddenly, knocking her chair slightly askew. You planned this. Bought the land years ago. Waited for the right moment to strike. I met her eyes. I bought the land to protect our family business. You're the one who decided I wasn't part of that family anymore. The vote wasn't even close. The board accepted Eastbridge's acquisition offer unanimously, with one abstention, our father. He sat in silence, his eyes on no one. Clarissa left the room without another word. No exit speech, no apology. Just the quiet click of her heels fading down the hallway. I remained seated for a moment, letting the silence settle. I hadn't wanted this moment to feel satisfying. And it didn't. It felt necessary, like a reset that had been coming for years. Truth, once buried under ego and ambition, had finally stepped into the light. 1 year later, I stood on the rooftop terrace of the newly renamed Harborview Hotel, once known as Camden Point. The name had changed, the branding had shifted, but the soul of the place remained intact. The ocean breeze still carried the same scent of salt and pine, and the view of the harbor still stretched wide and peaceful beneath the afternoon sun. Eastbridge had delivered on every promise. The transition had been clean. Staff were retained. The standards held. And the community, the lifeblood of these properties, never felt the rupture. They just saw a better, steadier version of what they already loved. Julian Barrett, now my professional partner and still as sharp-eyed as ever, joined me on the rooftop. He handed over a slim quarterly report with a slight smile. Revenue's up 17% across the region, he said. Camden alone is outperforming projections. I skimmed the numbers, nodded once. Guests notice when a hotel's run by people who give a damn. He chuckled. I've learned that from you. As consulting director for Eastbridge's regional properties, I didn't have an office with a view. I didn't want one. My work was in the details. Contract negotiations, quality control, supplier alignment. I worked behind the scenes, exactly where I was most effective. No corporate politics, no press releases, just real progress. Julian hesitated for a moment and asked, "Have you seen your father lately?" "Once a month," I said. "Dinners. Nothing heavy." after the board voted to approve the East Bridge deal, he quietly stepped down from Halcyon's leadership. He never spoke publicly about Clarissa, never defended her either. Just faded into the background, older, quieter, maybe finally tired of choosing between his children. "And your sister?" Julian asked carefully. "Langford Vision filed for bankruptcy protection last month," I replied, my voice even. "Turns out a degree and ambition don't build loyalty. Or sustainability." He didn't comment. He didn't need to. We stood in silence for a while, watching a fishing boat trace a path along the water below. I thought of the years I spent at Halcyon, the things I built that no one saw until they were almost taken away. And I thought of Clarissa, of what she could have built if she hadn't been so obsessed with winning. My phone buzzed. A message from my father. "Dinner tonight. Bringing the grandkids." I smiled and typed back a quick reply. Confirmation. The children were never part of the betrayal. I made sure they knew they were still welcome, still family. They didn't need to inherit the fractures their parents created. I looked one last time at the terrace, the people, the land. That land, solid, unshaken, had always been the true legacy. Clarissa had chased titles. I had secured foundations, and in the end, that's what lasted. I turned and walked toward the stairwell. Not because I was done, but because it was time to go home. Dinner was waiting. The parts of family that were worth keeping still showed up at the table. A few weeks after the Harbor View anniversary, I took a quiet drive up the coast to Bar Harbor. No meetings, no schedules. Just a personal visit to the place where it had all started. The inn was still there, Halcyon's very first property. It wasn't part of the East Bridge acquisition. Clarissa had held on to it during the asset review, claiming it was symbolic. But what she didn't understand was what it symbolized, or to whom. I parked along the same gravel lot I'd pulled into as a teenager, back when I used to shadow the maintenance team during summer breaks, back when I still believed that family meant the same thing to everyone at the table. The front porch creaked the way it always had. The shutters were newer, the sign freshly painted, but the bones of the place hadn't changed. That was the thing about true legacy. It doesn't depend on polish. It survives through care, not spectacle. Inside, the lobby smelled like polished wood and brewed coffee. Familiar, comfortable. I nodded to the front desk clerk, who didn't recognize me, which was fine. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to remember. In a small alcove near the fireplace was a photo I hadn't seen in years. My grandfather, standing in front of the building with a tool belt slung around his waist and a crooked smile. He'd built the original staircase by hand. My father once told me he refused to let anyone else touch the railings until he was satisfied with every curve. That photo had once hung in my office at Halcyon. Clarissa said it looked dated and moved it to storage. I sat in the armchair across from the fireplace and let the memories roll over me. Not the dramatic ones, not the ones that made headlines, but the quiet ones. Long nights patching broken pipework. Early mornings checking linen deliveries. Conversations with housekeepers and line cooks and night clerks. That's what I fought for. My phone vibrated. A message from Miguel at Harborview. Just finished a tour with a travel writer. She said our team feels like a family. You built that. I smiled. It wasn't my name on the signage anymore. But the culture I helped create lived on. The work had never been about controlling buildings. It was about building something people wanted to stay in, staff and guests alike. I stood, gave one last glance to the photo of my grandfather, and quietly left the inn. As I drove back toward Boston, The trees blurred past in streaks of gold and green. The road was familiar, but I was not the same man who once drove it in silence after being forced out of a boardroom. I had no desire to return to Halcyon, to reclaim anything. What needed reclaiming had already been secured: the truth, the foundation, and the future. And most of all, the legacy that would never again be misplaced. Because I had made sure it was anchored in more than just name. It was anchored in value, in people, in land. The smell of roasted rosemary chicken filled the kitchen as I set the table for 4. It was a quiet Saturday evening, the kind that once felt impossible in the chaos of quarterly reviews and boardroom battles. But now, with the fireplace flickering and soft jazz playing in the background, it felt like peace had finally arrived. Not the loud kind, but the kind you build slowly, like stone upon stone. At exactly 6, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to see my father standing there, his coat slightly dusted from the breeze, holding the hands of my niece and nephew. They bolted past him and wrapped their arms around my waist like they'd been holding the hug in all day. My father followed with a quiet smile. "Dinner smells like your mother's used to," he said, removing his scarf and looking around the room. "She'd have loved this." We sat down, and for the next hour, we didn't talk about hotels or leases or the board. We talked about school science fairs, favorite cartoons, and the time I accidentally glued my fingers together in 2nd grade. Laughter came easier now. So did quiet understanding. After dessert, as the kids settled on the couch with an old animated movie, my father and I moved to the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "She called me last week," he said after a long pause. He didn't need to say her name. "Clarissa." I nodded slowly, waiting. "She asked if I thought you'd ever forgive her." I looked out over the harbor. The water reflected the city lights in long, trembling streaks. "Forgiveness isn't the issue," I said. "Trust is." He nodded, taking a slow sip. "You didn't just protect a company, Marcus. You protected the people in it, and the family outside of it." I let the words hang there. They mattered more than he realized. Later that night, after he and the kids left, I stood alone in the doorway, the warmth of the evening still clinging to the walls. I looked at the framed blueprint of the Bar Harbor Inn, our first, and then at the text on my phone. "Thanks for tonight." They needed that. So did I. It came from him. The man who once couldn't choose between his children, now quietly acknowledging the one who stayed behind to hold up what mattered. I walked back to the dining room and sat down, letting the stillness soak in. This wasn't the ending I imagined when I was pushed out the door at Halcyon. But it was better, truer, more lasting. If this story moved you, even a little, don't forget to sub, like, share, and leave a comment. Because sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that deserve to be heard the most. I looked around one last time before turning off the lights. The house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. And that, more than any board vote or title, was the win that mattered most.